Imagine, if you will, that terrorists have come into possession of portable surface-to-air missiles, which they plan to smuggle into the United States and use to shoot down a commercial aircraft. One unfortunate fact about manned portable missiles, or MANPADS, is that they can operate outside the security perimeter of most airports and are hard to spot from the ground. So in our scenario, the Department of Homeland Security advises the President to deploy drones above major airports to spot the terrorists on the ground before they fire. Another government agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, prohibits drone flights near airports. But these government surveillance vehicles will have extra safety precautions, such as next-generation sense and avoidance sensors, and so they've been granted an emergency waiver. Before making a decision whether to do this or not, here are some questions we might want to think about from privacy and civil liberties perspectives, leaving aside for the moment constitutional concerns. What permissible uses of imagery and analysis collected from the airport area surveillance drones should be allowed for? And with whom may the information be shared? For how long should the data be retained? Can we make available any collateral information for policing functions, say, unrelated to aviation-related terrorism? In other words, what if the system spots a rape in progress? Drones are not an inherently limited technology. They don't come with a technological off switch which says, use the data only for good purposes. So we can also imagine that other, more problematic applications might arise. Uses that are plausible, but which begin to raise specific questions. Say, for example, the police decide to station a drone as a permanent surveillance platform over a high-crime neighborhood in an urban area. What are the limits of its use? When we use drones to capture images of a high-crime area or a hostage situation, they might very well collect collateral data about intensely personal and even embarrassing but non-criminal activities. The man walking to his car or visiting his mistress is of no legal concern to the government, but his image might be captured along with the good data that we want. Finally, there's no guarantee that drones won't be used for malevolent purposes by whoever pilots them. Whether I use a toy drone to peer into my neighbor's window or a burglar uses it to case a house for robbery, the technology at issue serves to amplify our capabilities in ways that enable some of our basest instincts. So what should we do about it? These are hard questions, and honestly, society as a whole doesn't have a lot of answers yet. Even as drone applications proliferate, rules on their use and boundaries that should apply remain very unclear. Manufacturers call them unmanned aerial vehicles, that is, UAVs, or more grandly, unmanned aircraft systems, which have their own acronym, UASs. Everybody else in the world calls them drones. So to give you a flavor of some of the issues we'll be talking about, let me tell you a personal story. A while back, I agreed to participate in a contest among friends that we called the Lawfare Drone Smackdown. The idea was intended to be a fun way of exploring new technology. Each of us went out and bought a drone. In fact, we all bought the same one, a Parrot AR. They are small and lightweight, made of styrofoam with 4 rotor fans for lift. They're so cheap that you can buy them for less than $300. Each carries a small onboard camera, and the controls are simple. You can actually download the controlling program as an app and put it on your smartphone. Now, the idea behind the game was pretty childish, actually. I'm almost embarrassed to admit it. We planned to fly the drones in aerial combat against one another. The last drone standing, or flying, would be declared the winner. In the course of this contest, though, we learned some very interesting things about drones. For example, we originally planned to have the Smackdown at a park in Washington, D.C. We had to move it at the last minute to a family member's yard in suburban Virginia. Why? Because all drone traffic is illegal within 30 miles of Washington. We actually got a notice from the FAA to move the event. Why is drone traffic illegal? Well, apparently for safety reasons, though the idea that our small drones, which couldn't fly above 100 feet, posed a danger to the president or anyone else makes me wonder. On the other hand, drones have landed on the White House lawn, so who knows? We also learned that drones are excellent surveillance platforms. We used the onboard computers on our $300 models to record videos of the dogfights that we engaged in. And though the quality was sketchy at times, the images are generally clear and easy to see. It's pretty evident that drone technology is a powerful way of enhancing observational capabilities. It also became clear that drones are not just advanced versions of rubber band-propelled balsa wood toy airplanes. Rather, they're sophisticated, cyber-enabled machines which can be linked to computerized control systems. At the very heart of a drone is the existence of the cyberlink, for that connection allows the drone to be operated without a pilot physically present. This was brought home in a painful way during the smackdown, after my opponent, who went on to win the competition, hacked my control system, took control of my drone, and caused it to crash. So in this lecture, first, I want to describe drone technology in a bit more detail, so that you might better understand how it works and what it's capable of. Second, we'll examine some domestic uses of drones. And third, we'll consider some unique legal and policy issues and ask the big question: how are we as a society going to deal with this technology? Now, for most people, the word drones conjures up the image of a lethal missile-armed predator or reaper, like the drones deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan wars and afterwards. Once the U.S. demonstrated the Predator's capabilities, drones became an indispensable military tool and part of our vocabulary. You can see examples of them in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. But military drones are but a small fraction of the type of drones used in the United States and around the world today. The Israelis were the first to design the modern glider-type drone in the 1970s. They built small, lightweight devices, making them inexpensive to build and difficult to shoot down. Larger drones soon followed, and today, some of them are quite large. Thousands of drone platforms now exist for a wide variety of purposes, from scientific research to military operations. Drones are employed by governments and by the private sector. Drones themselves are unmanned, but controlled by a human operator. These remote operators typically are highly skilled and must be trained for their particular missions. In the military, for example, drone pilots learn how to carry out intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance missions, and also how to conduct and respond to electronic attacks, and how to implement strike missions with weapons, and conduct search and rescue operations, so on. For the military, remote piloting greatly reduces the risks to U.S. personnel and makes the vehicles cheaper to produce. This latter point often gets overlooked. Although drones are unmanned, trained crews steer the craft, analyze the images that the cameras send back, and act on what they see. In the military context, that might mean firing missiles at a surveilled target. In a civilian context, it might mean taking photographs. Put another way, drones are not autonomous, at least not yet. A human is always in the loop of control. Now, the control base for this remotely piloted vehicle can be anywhere that you're able to establish a communications link. It's well known that most of the drone missions in Afghanistan were controlled from Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, although takeoffs and landings typically were handled locally. Indeed, the control system is the most sophisticated, or perhaps intricate is a better word, part of the system. Commands from the controller are encrypted and uplinked to satellite, which then downlinks the commands to the drone. As an aside, one of the most significant cyber losses America has suffered in recent years occurred when, for a brief period of time, someone, and we suspect the Chinese, cracked this encryption system and was reading the drone communication traffic. Drone sensor data flows back along the same channel. Or if you want, the sensor data can be directly shared with others. So when a Reaper drone takes pictures over Afghanistan, the downlink of video data can go straight to troops on the ground, even though the orders directing it would be coming from the United States. Another aside, drones are actually quite slow. Even famous ones like the Predator don't go faster than 135 miles per hour. And civilian drones, like the Parrot I bought, move along at a pokey 10 miles an hour maximum. But though they're slow, they're also quite durable. The Navy's 131-foot Triton drone has flown completely across the country at 50,000 feet without stopping. So now that we know how they work, let's talk a bit about what drones do. First, there are the military applications. In 2015, the Pentagon reportedly controlled some 7,000 military-grade drones, up from fewer than 50 at the start of the 21st century. These have been used increasingly in military missions overseas, first running reconnaissance, and then targeting al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, hostile groups such as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, or ISIS, as well as Hamas and Hezbollah, are said to have obtained their own drones. The inevitable result of such proliferation is that malevolent uses could become a problem in the United States. As was reported in Wired magazine not long ago, a $400 remote-controlled quadcopter landed on the White House grounds. Fortunately, it was unarmed, but it need not have been. Adding to such concerns, a recent government exercise demonstrated that a quadcopter could be strapped to 3 pounds of an inert explosive and turned into a flying bomb. It was the DJI Phantom II, a slightly newer version of the drone that landed at the White House. Another military exercise pitted $5,000 worth of drones against a convoy of armored vehicles. And according to Wired, the drones won. So now let's turn our focus to some domestic uses of drones. The Department of Homeland Security uses drones, for example, for border patrol security. These vehicles conduct surveillance of areas and routes that are inaccessible to regular patrols. Likewise, we use drones over the ocean to maintain maritime domain awareness and to track shipping heading to the United States. We use drones for emergency preparation and disaster response. Before the next hurricane hits, drones will have planned evacuation routes and anticipated vulnerable locations. In the immediate aftermath of a major storm, they also allow us to observe the catastrophic effects and begin remediation planning. And drones can even provide emergency restoration of cell phone coverage. And by providing a visible police presence, they deter criminal behavior in unpatrolled areas. United Nations peacekeepers are using drones for the same sorts of reasons. In agriculture, farmers use drones to monitor crop growth at a local level and in greater detail than might be provided, for example, by satellite photos. Drones have even been used as a replacement for crop dusting airplanes, as a way of spraying pesticides and eradicating pest infestation. Meanwhile, scientists and environmentalists are increasingly using drones for environmental monitoring as well. With these aerial vehicles, we can track wildlife, monitor droughts and flooding, and watch the stability of locks, dams, and levees in remote areas. When I was in Yellowstone recently, I saw drones being used to track the wild bison. And I also saw signs that prohibited all the visitors from flying drones in the park. With the right equipment, drones can sample the pollution over cities and test concentrations of carbon dioxide in remote locations. They might even fly into the eye of a hurricane without risking human life. In short, Anywhere that humans can go or might want to go to see or do something is potentially a place where drones can lead us. One of the most interesting commercial applications is the use of drones by news-gathering operations. Drones are much cheaper to operate than traffic helicopters, and when large demonstrations occur, like a march on Washington or a riot, for example, they can provide a safe platform for news gathering. Of course, drones are also going to be used by paparazzi to stalk celebrities. Film crews are another big user. Drones are cheaper and easier to use than helicopters. One great application of the drone was a viral video produced by BBC on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. The use of the drone to take the footage made the vision quite dramatic. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, a company began delivering beer to ice fishermen out on the frozen northern lakes. And in Singapore, a restaurant is using drones to deliver food and drink to its customers. Big retailers and package delivery services are interested in drones as distribution vehicles to reach customers. Unfortunately for the Minnesota fishermen, at least for now, the FAA has stopped the beer deliveries. But when the rules for commercial use of drones are eventually written and implemented, the sky will no longer be the limit. And therein lies the rub. Just as news organizations might want to employ drones to watch a riot as it unfolds, or some other event for that matter, the government wants drones to enhance its law enforcement and homeland security capabilities. We can readily imagine some government uses that would be appropriate. Say, SWAT team reconnaissance during a hostage situation, or in the same way that police helicopters are currently used in hot pursuit of a suspect. During the riots in Baltimore, after the death of the police arrestee Freddie Gray, law enforcement authorities used drones and airplanes equipped with sophisticated detection equipment to monitor the volatile situation. We can also imagine drones being useful for search and rescue missions. But still, because of their surveillance capabilities, drones could impinge upon personal privacy and other civil liberties without proper legal guidelines and oversight. Like swarming motor scooters on the ground, the proliferation of drones in our skies might also threaten aviation safety. We can prohibit certain uses altogether, of course. Using a drone to case a house for burglary will still be a crime, just as burglary is now. And it's a near certainty that the Peeping Tom laws will be modified if they need to be, to include a prohibition on drones. But hard questions will come from mixed uses. Instances where data collection includes collateral collection of information and imagery. Market predictions suggest that the manufacture and sale of drones will be a multi-billion-dollar industry. Whether we like it or not, drones are here to stay. Given their utility, it seems far more likely that we will control drone use through rules and regulations rather than ban them. First, there will be safety regulations. When first presented with the question, an administrative law judge said that absent written rules, the Federal Aviation Administration could not regulate drones, since the court viewed them as being no different than model aircraft. That led the FAA to issue its first commercial drone license in June 2014 to BP, the former British Petroleum, which had requested permission to use a 13-pound drone to survey its equipment and pipelines in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. At the same time it issued that first license, the FAA moved to restrict everyone else who didn't have one. Later, the FAA issued a draft of its proposed rules for hobbyists, like my friends at the Smackdown. They proposed that we can freely fly our small, remote-controlled drones weighing less than 50 pounds so long as the drones stay away from airports, keep below 400 feet, and remain within the controller's sight. Anyone else, including news organizations and the package express companies and the retailers, would have to wait for new regulations or get a one-off exemption. Few exemptions have been issued, initially mostly for closed movie sets. It's possible that a final rule might require the operators of large drones to obtain airworthiness certificates and fly them with licensed pilots. Those types of requirements would be quite expensive. In the meantime, for as long as the current general prohibition stands, the ice fishermen in Minnesota will have to go and get their own beer. Privacy and civil liberties pose still more interesting issues and questions. On one side are some academic researchers who've been following the FAA debate. They contend that the FAA imposed restrictions on drones will jeopardize their work and undermine basic education. Paul Voss, an associate professor of engineering at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, who coordinated a protest letter signed by nearly 30 researchers, wrote, "Aircraft are being defined so broadly that it leaves no space for innovation. If you go to Walmart and buy a 15-inch remote-controlled helicopter and use it for fun, it's a toy. But if you use it for education or research from 4 feet off the grass, it's an unmanned aircraft system and not allowed to fly." On the other side of the coin is the state of California. California's legislature adopted a law requiring police departments throughout the state to get a warrant from a judge in almost every situation where they might use a drone, except for emergencies like a hostage taking. Nor is it just the government we're worried about. In Kentucky, a man used his gun to shoot down an $1,800 drone that was hovering roughly 200 feet up over his neighbor's house. He was arrested for criminal mischief and violating an FAA regulation against shooting down an aircraft. But the shooter said that the drone was invading his privacy and stalking him, laws that might apply when a drone with sensors hovers over your yard without your permission. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor told a law school class in prepared remarks recently, "There are drones flying over the air randomly that are recording everything that's happening on what we consider to be our private property. I don't like the fact that someone I don't know can pick up, if they're a private citizen, one of these drones and fly it over my property." Now, I can see both sides of the argument, and by now I'm certain you can as well. So this brings us back to the scenario I outlined at the beginning of the lecture, in which the United States government hypothetically is responding to intelligence that terrorists have come into possession of man-portable surface-to-air missiles, or MANPADS, and that they plan to smuggle the explosives into the country and use them to target commercial aircraft. I've borrowed and modified this scenario from a symposium conducted by the Journal of National Security Law and Policy, where I'm a senior editor. The drones in our scenario are state-of-the-art. For one thing, let's give them automatic target recognition signal processing capability to enable the detection and identification and classification of possible portable missiles. In other words, the digital pictures they capture can be used to automatically identify possible threats. And to add to the challenge, let's make them capable of tracking suspicious movements. For example, subjects of FBI terrorism investigations from geolocation data collected off of smartphones and tablets. And let's say that they can flag suspicious activity, say vehicles operating erratically, capturing related license plate information and tracking the vehicles in question. In other words, a platform with the whole 9 yards of new surveillance technology. Now let's imagine that while on patrol for counter-terrorist purposes, the drone spots images that might convey a drug deal. Or they could be just pictures of 2 guys meeting in the woods. Should the analysts who collect this data share it with the local police department? On the one hand, the answer seems clearly to be yes. We don't want government officials to turn a blind eye during the course of their duties to crime they happen upon. The Fourth Amendment likely would be no legal barrier to sharing the information. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. In the context of the regulation of police activities, we sometimes define reasonableness by what is called the plain view doctrine. That is, the idea that if the police are lawfully in a place for one purpose, then evidence of other crimes they see in plain view is fair game. Their actions in being there are reasonable, so the result of their observation is lawful, wherever the evidence may lead them. The classic example of this is when the police respond to a call reporting, say, domestic violence, and lawfully enter a house only to see narcotics or a marijuana plant in plain view. In our scenario, if the drone surveillance were lawful in the first instance, we might, by parallel reasoning, conclude that we should not turn a blind eye to the evidence of a potential drug deal, or a rape or a robbery, that's also observed. On the other hand, there's an awful good argument for the answer to be no. One way in which we limit government activities that impinge on civil liberties is through use limitations. That is, the idea that information and data collected for a specific use can only be used for that particular purpose. We're all familiar with this type of limitation. Everyone knows, for example, that only the Census Bureau can use personally identifying census data, and that it isn't generally shared with other offices of the government. The same is true, with some limited exceptions, for your tax filings and health data. The government collects the information for a specific purpose, and in order to encourage complete honesty, promises not to use it for other reasons. And that makes sense in this context, doesn't it? We might approve a use for valid counterterrorism purposes to prevent the destruction of civilian aircraft because of the catastrophic harms that are being averted, but we might not authorize the same intrusion for a run-of-the-mill crime. Of course, line drawing between crimes is hard. It's difficult to say we should ignore a murder, but we could do it. Here's one idea. Let's pass a law that would authorize data collected for counterterrorism purposes, as in our hypothetical, to be shared with the police for other purposes only if those purposes involved responding to or otherwise preventing or mitigating an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. So murder and rape would get a response, but drug trafficking would not. Even that application requires judgment, of course, but as you can see, we can imagine ways of constraining sharing that aren't nonsensical. So let me close this lecture by offering a few personal thoughts on some other limitations that we might consider for drones, based on an essay I did a few years ago. The use of drones in a military capacity, while armed, should be severely restricted to situations of actual invasion or insurrection. The use of drones for domestic surveillance of First Amendment activity, that is, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, should be considered fundamentally at odds with U.S. constitutional principles and prohibited. Drones equipped with novel sensor arrays, like, say, a new facial recognition technology, would not be permitted absent a clearly demonstrated need and a careful consideration of countervailing privacy and civil liberties concerns. Drones would not be used as a platform for the collection of massive, unstructured data sets, say the long-term surveillance of an entire community that's a high-crime area, because that type of collection could form the basis for sophisticated tracking and behavioral analytics. And drones would be considered unsuitable for use as a routine means of surveillance in non-threatening situations. For all of these ideas, value judgments and choices need to be made. So Congress has to be engaged. After all, these are interesting, difficult, and indeterminate choices we will be making. And isn't that what our elected representatives are for? Technology and the law need to be harmonized to ensure that the state remains secure and its people remain free.